She moved before he finished grabbing her wrist, not a flinch, not a gasp. One fluid rotation that turned his grip into a lever, and suddenly Park Sung-jin, lieutenant to the most feared man in Seoul, was coming off his seat with his wrist bent at an angle it was never designed to reach. The coffee pot connected with the nerve cluster below his elbow, with a sound that was almost polite. Almost. The second bodyguard stood up. She was already inside his reach before he could use it. One elbow, one jaw. He sat back down like someone had simply switched him off. 4 seconds. Total. The diner went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent light buzzing overhead. Naomi Carter set the coffee pot down on the table. Her hands were loose at her sides. Her breathing was controlled, and her left knee, the one with the brace hidden underneath her uniform, was held perfectly, deliberately still. She had been in Seoul for 3 years. She had been surviving longer than that. And the man sitting across the table from her, the one who had not moved a single inch during all of this, the one who was now slowly lifting his coffee cup and drinking from it like nothing had happened. He was watching her with an expression that was not surprise, it was recognition, like he had been waiting for exactly this moment, like he had sat down in her section tonight already knowing what she was capable of, already decided, already certain, like the whole thing had simply confirmed what he'd walked in here believing. Kang Ji Hoon set his cup down, looked at Sung-jin on the floor, then looked back at Naomi with something that might have been mild disappointment. But it was not directed at her, and that was the moment Naomi Carter's life split into before and after. She just didn't know yet which side of that split was going to be harder to survive. If you are the kind of person who stays for stories that don't let you breathe, you are in exactly the right place. Hit that like button right now, because what happens next is going to change how you see everything that came before it. Naomi had grown up in New Orleans in the kind of neighborhood where you learned early that the city's beauty was not meant for you. The tourists got the jazz and the beignets and the wrought-iron balconies trailing purple and gold. She got the other parts, the parts that didn't make the postcards, the parts where the heat pressed down on everything like a hand that never lifted, where the foster system moved children from house to house like furniture being stored between owners who didn't really want it. She had lived in 6 different homes before she turned 16. Some of them were fine. Some of them were not fine in ways she had eventually learned to convert from wound into weapon, into awareness, into reflex, into the ability to read a room the moment she entered it and identify every exit without appearing to look. The fight that sealed her juvenile record happened when she was 17. A man in her 3rd foster home had decided that her foster sister's closed door was more of a suggestion than a boundary. Naomi had not seen it that way. The record was sealed. The man recovered eventually. Her foster sister never fully did, but that was a different kind of wound and a different kind of story. What the fight gave her beyond the record was clarity. She understood after that night exactly what she was capable of and exactly what she was willing to do to protect someone she loved. Those were useful things to know about yourself. She filed them away and kept moving. She came to Seoul on a teaching contract at 23, English literature, a school in Mapogu that had seemed from the application materials like a genuine opportunity. It lasted 4 months. The fight that ended it happened on a Tuesday afternoon in a corridor when a student who was twice her size had a younger girl backed into a corner, and Naomi intervened the way she always intervened, efficiently, completely, without hesitation. The school called it disproportionate. The termination letter was delivered by a man who wouldn't look at her while he handed it over. After that, she couldn't afford to go home. Home was New Orleans, and New Orleans was the past, and the past was a weight she had been carrying at arm's length for years. So, she stayed, found the diner in Itaewon, the kind of neighborhood that absorbed people who needed somewhere to land without being asked about where they'd come from. The pay was thin. The hours were punishing. Her knee ached every single shift from an injury 3 years old that had never been properly treated because she had never had insurance that covered it. But she was invisible there. And invisible, for Naomi Carter from New Orleans, had always been as close to safe as she'd ever gotten. That safety ended the night 3 black SUVs parked outside the diner at 2:47 in the morning. She noticed the room before she noticed him. That was how she always worked, environment first, then individuals. Regulars who had been nursing coffee for hours simply stood, paid, and left without explanation. No eye contact with each other, no conversation, no visible coordination. They moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had learned something essential about this neighborhood and were applying it without hesitation. Within 90 seconds, half the diner had emptied, wordlessly. Naomi was behind the counter watching all of it when the door opened. Kang Ji Hoon was not what she expected, and she hadn't expected anything. She didn't know his name yet, but she knew the room's reaction to him, and in her experience, the room's reaction to someone told you more than their face ever would. He was dressed simply, dark coat, nothing flashy, nothing that announced itself. The bodyguards flanking him were the ones who looked expensive. He didn't need to perform wealth because wealth was not the point. Power was the point, and power that had to announce itself was already a lesser kind. He walked to a booth in her section and sat down with the ease of a man who understood that every room he entered had already arranged itself around his presence before he arrived. He ordered in English without being asked. Perfect, unaccented English, smooth and deliberate. He already knew she was American. She registered this behind her expression and kept her face neutral, because reacting to it would tell him something, and she had already decided not to give him anything he hadn't earned. The exchange was brief and careful. She was not warm, not rude, just efficient. Professional in the way that people who have worked hard service jobs understand, where you perform competence and nothing more, because competence is the only currency you have and you spend it carefully. He watched her the way someone watches a thing they have already made a decision about. His lieutenant sat to his left. Park Sung-jin had the look of a man who had been confusing cruelty for authority for so long that the distinction had stopped existing for him. Expensive watch, eyes that moved over Naomi like she was part of the furniture. Not invisible exactly, just irrelevant. She took their order, brought the food, moved through the routine of the shift and did not make conversation because conversation in a room like this was a liability she couldn't afford. And then Sung-jin wanted more water. She was mid-task at another table. She held up one finger, a moment, just one moment, and finished what she was doing. It was a standard thing, the kind of small, necessary pause that anyone in any service job understands without being told. Park Sung-jin was not anyone. He reached out and grabbed her wrist, not out of anger, not even really out of impatience. He grabbed it the way someone grabs a door handle, automatically, reflexively, because he had decided somewhere in the architecture of his thinking that she was an object, and objects did not get to hold up a finger and make him wait. That decision was the worst one he made all year, and you already saw what happened next. Now here is what you didn't see. After the room had gone silent, after the coffee pot and the elbow and the 2 men finding the floor, after Ji Hoon had finished his coffee with that expression of measured, directed disappointment, he stood, reached into his coat, placed an envelope on the table without ceremony. Naomi didn't touch it. "For the mess," he said, "and the overtime. I don't want your money." He looked at her, not with anger, not with the expression of a powerful man whose dignity had been touched, with something more deliberate than either of those things, the look of someone taking a careful, patient measurement. "You'll want it by morning." He left. The black SUVs pulled away into the Seoul night. The diner settled back into its fluorescent hum. Naomi stood still for a moment. Then she opened the envelope. The amount inside was not an apology, and it was not compensation, and it was not generosity. It was a marker, the way hunters mark territory, the way certain kinds of men mark people they have decided are going to be useful. She was holding physical evidence that Kang Ji Hoon had formed a conclusion about her before he walked through the door tonight. She didn't know what the conclusion was yet. She knew it existed. Min Jae materialized at her elbow. 23 years old, warm eyes, the kind of person who brought homemade dosirak to share on night shifts and somehow made a diner in Itaewon feel like a place where you could exhale slightly. "Do you know who that was?" Naomi set the envelope on the counter. "Tell me." Min Jae told her everything, the name, the territory, the reach of it, not just organized crime, but political connections, protected relationships, layers of influence that meant law enforcement was not a rescue option, was never going to be a rescue option. And the story of the restaurant owner in Mapo-gu 3 months ago, whose family had relocated overnight after declining one of Ji Hoon's arrangements. No threats made, none needed. Naomi didn't go pale, didn't cry, didn't reach for her phone or her coat or any of the things a person reaches for when they're frightened. She got very, very still. The stillness was from New Orleans, from the foster homes, from every room she had ever been in where the wrong reaction could cost her more than the silence. She had learned at 11 years old that stillness was not passivity. It was computation. It was the body buying time for the mind to catch up. She went back to work. The shift didn't end until 6. The tables needed clearing. She didn't sleep that morning. She lay in her small apartment and turned the whole thing over in her mind, the way you turn something heavy. Slowly, looking at every side, not rushing the assessment. The recognition on Ji Hoon's face. The English ordered without prompting. The envelope with its specific, deliberate amount. The way he had looked at Sung-jin on the floor with disappointment rather than anger. These were pieces of a picture she didn't have the full shape of yet. But she was from New Orleans, and New Orleans taught you to read the weather before the weather arrived. She could feel what was coming. She just didn't know exactly when. 3 days later, she found out. Her neighborhood laundromat. 11 at night. She did her standard scan when she arrived. Exits, occupants, anything that felt displaced or wrong. She found nothing. He was already there. Sitting in the corner with a paper cup of vending machine coffee, not doing anything. Not on his phone, not reading. Just sitting with the specific, settled stillness of someone who had been waiting long enough that they'd made peace with the waiting. No bodyguards. She checked twice and found nothing both times. The absence of bodyguards was the thing that tightened her chest. Because bodyguards were a performance. They told the room that someone important had arrived and needed protecting. Coming alone told her something entirely different. It told her he was already certain she wasn't a threat to him. That certainty was its own kind of message, delivered without a word being spoken. She sat down across from him. She did not run. Running would hand him a fear she refused to let him have. "How long have you been watching me?" "Long enough to know you're wasted here." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." Then he told her what he knew, and the list was thorough enough to make the room feel smaller. The New Orleans foster records, the sealed juvenile file, what she'd done, who she'd done it to, why, the man who had left the building with a different relationship to his own body than he'd arrived with, the teaching contract in Seoul, the specific corridor, the specific student she had defended, the termination letter, and the knee, injured 3 years ago, never treated, no insurance, no real prospect of insurance on what the diner paid. He had turned her entire life into a document, organised her history into leverage, and sat across from her in a laundromat at 11 at night, presenting it back to her like a file he owned. She understood this clearly and completely before she let herself respond to anything else, because she needed to see it for exactly what it was. Control, dressed as knowledge. What do you want? Personal security. You work directly with me. 8 million won a month. Housing is covered. A pause. His eyes dropped, briefly, specifically, to her left leg. Full medical? The medical. He had included it specifically because he knew what it meant. She felt the fury of it move through her and kept it completely off her face. What happens if I say no? He didn't threaten her. This was something she would think about many times afterward, that he never once issued a direct threat. Instead, he said, with the specific unsettling quality of total honesty, "Nothing from me. But you've seen what happens when a room knows I've walked in. That's not a situation that resolves quietly on its own. People who've seen what you've seen have short luck. You're threatening me without threatening me. I'm describing your circumstances accurately. There's a difference." She stood up, moved to the dryer, pulled her laundry out and folded it. Everything, deliberately, taking her full time with every item. It was the only thing in the room she could control completely, and she was going to control it completely. She left without giving him an answer. He let her go. And that, the letting go, the patience of it, the absolute confidence that she would come back to him, unsettled her more than anything else he had said. Before you find out what she decides, I need you to hit subscribe right now. This channel is built for people who want stories that actually cost something. Turn on notifications because this is a series and you do not want to come in late. She went to Min Jae's apartment that night. Min Jae's place was warm in the way of homes that are genuinely lived in. Photographs covering an entire wall, a bookshelf with broken spines, the smell of something that had been cooked earlier still sitting pleasantly in the air. Min Jae's boyfriend was there, the kind of man who moved through a home like he was glad to be in it. He brought tea without being asked, and then went to another room to give them space. And the ease of that, the simple unthought kindness of it, sat in Naomi's chest like something she'd forgotten the taste of. She watched Min Jae and her boyfriend the way you watch something through glass that you cannot quite reach. Min Jae urged her toward Busan, a cousin, a real distance between herself and Ji Hoon's name. "I've been having fresh starts since I was 9 years old," Naomi said. "They all end up looking the same." She accepted Ji Hoon's offer the next morning. She called the number on the playing card she found tucked into her folded laundry. Of course he had left it there, of course, and said yes in 2 syllables with no preamble. She told herself it was survival. It was also the first time in 3 years she had felt something other than the specific exhaustion of a person treading water, indefinitely. She didn't hold that second thing up to the light because she had a strong feeling it wouldn't survive being examined directly. The apartment in Hanam-dong was nicer than anywhere she had lived since she was old enough to have opinions about where she lived. Clean lines, a real kitchen, city views that at night turned Seoul into something that looked almost like a promise. She moved through the space on the first day with the careful attention of someone assessing a trap. Because beautiful traps were still traps, and this one knew it was beautiful, and had made its peace with that. Sergeant Yu met her the first morning with the expression of a man who had already spent 15 minutes deciding she was going to be a waste of his very limited patience. Retired military, built like someone had concentrated a larger person. He looked at her height, at the brace she hadn't bothered to hide that morning, and made a sound that was not quite a word. She looked back at him and said nothing. She had been underestimated by more frightening people than Sergeant Yu, and she had learned to let the underestimation do its work. It was almost always useful eventually. Day 3 of training, he found her knee. Deliberately, systematically, with the focus of someone who had been given a set of blueprints and was testing the weakest wall. He attacked the angle she instinctively protected, and she went down. She got up. He attacked it again. She went down again. He watched without moving, without commentary, without offering a hand. The third time, something changed in her. She stopped trying to protect the knee from the attack and started rebuilding her entire stance around eliminating the angle he needed to reach it. It wasn't fast, it wasn't graceful, but it worked. And when it worked, you moved to the next drill without a word. No acknowledgement, just continuation. She understood he wasn't dismantling her. He was finding out what she was made of underneath the parts that could be broken. Sung Jin's campaign ran parallel to all of this, underground, patient. He moved through Ji Hoon's men quietly, a word here, an implication there. She'd gotten lucky in the diner. The coffee pot, anyone could swing a coffee pot. Ji Hoon's judgment was being influenced by something, and he never finished that sentence, but he didn't need to, because the sentence finished itself in every listener's head in exactly the direction he intended. Naomi heard about it through Min Jae. She didn't confront Sung Jin. She filed it with the cold precision she filed everything and continued. But she thought about it in the Hanam-dong apartment at night, about the man who had held this position before her, who had organized his entire sense of himself around being the person Ji Hoon trusted above everyone else, and who had watched that be handed to a woman he'd never met without warning or explanation. She understood the wound of that, even as she understood how dangerous the wound had made him. She was 3 weeks into the job when the thing happened that she hadn't prepared for. It started as a simple task, a security update delivered to Ji Hoon's office at the end of a long day. She came down the corridor, found the door slightly open, raised her hand to knock, stopped. He was alone, working through something at his desk, speaking Korean under his breath, not performing, not presenting, just thinking out loud. His jacket was off, the glass face, the controlled, calibrated expression she had never once seen slip in the 3 weeks she'd been in his orbit, was simply absent, not replaced by anything dramatic, just gone, the way a mask goes when the person wearing it believes the room is empty. She stood in the doorway for a moment and understood that she was seeing something she was not supposed to see. Not a secret exactly, something more private than a secret. The unguarded version of a man who was never, under any circumstances, unguarded. She withdrew silently, filed the report by message instead, and went back to her apartment. She lay in the dark and thought about the Korean he had been speaking. She had understood most of it, more than he knew, more than she had told anyone. The thing she hadn't prepared for was that she wanted to understand the rest. It built slowly after that, the way things build when you're trying not to let them build, quietly, incrementally, through accumulation. There was the night she arrived early for a briefing and found him standing at the floor-to-ceiling window looking at Seoul at midnight, and he didn't hear her come in, and she stood 3 feet behind him and looked at the city over his shoulder for a full 30 seconds before he turned and found her there. Neither of them moved for a moment. He said, in Korean, something about the city that translated roughly to, "It looks better from up here than it deserves to." She responded, without thinking, in Korean, not perfectly, but correctly, and with the specific rhythm of someone who had been listening to the way he used language and had absorbed it without deciding to. He looked at her differently after that. Not dramatically. Ji Hoon did nothing dramatically, but there was a quality of attention in how he looked at her that was distinct from how he looked at anything else, and she noticed it the way she noticed everything, which was to say, completely and immediately, and she decided to be very, very careful about what she did with the noticing. A week later, a business meeting she attended as security. A property developer, not a criminal, just a man who had borrowed from Ji Hoon's network and been slow about returning it. He had a family photo visible on his phone. She could see it clearly from where she stood. Ji Hoon negotiated quietly, almost gently, and in doing so, he dismantled the man's situation with such patient, unhurried precision. Every avenue the developer thought he had, closed one after another, without a raised voice, without an explicit threat, with only the soft, relentless pressure of total calm, that Naomi didn't fully register what she was watching until the middle of it. By the end, the developer had agreed to terms that would cost him years. Ji Hoon stood, buttoned his jacket, passed her in the hallway. "Good positioning tonight." He said it the way he said everything useful to her, direct, specific, no ornamentation. And then he was gone down the corridor, and she was standing in the hallway alone with the image of the family photo on the developer's phone and the sound of Ji Hoon's voice saying what he'd said, and she was trying to hold both things in her mind simultaneously and finding that they didn't fit together neatly. She called Min Jae. What if understanding someone completely just means you have a better view of something you can't change? Min Jae was quiet long enough that Naomi heard her boyfriend say something in the background, heard the small, comfortable sound of Min Jae's hand on his. "Then you have to decide if the view is worth the cost of standing there." Naomi sat with that for a long time. She didn't quit. She came back the next morning. She showed up with full knowledge of what she had seen, and she stayed. And she would spend a significant amount of time afterward turning over what that said about her, whether it was pragmatism or compromise or something that didn't have a clean name in any language she spoke. What she couldn't ignore, and eventually stopped trying to ignore, was the accumulation of small things that were building into something she didn't have architecture to hold yet. The way he handed her coffee in the mornings, she had never asked for it, and he had never mentioned it. It was simply there on the kitchen counter of the Hanam-dong apartment, the right amount of sugar, which she had never told him, and she had decided not to investigate how he knew. The night she came back from a difficult perimeter check, shoulder bruised from a contact she hadn't been able to fully slip, and found a medical kit on the kitchen counter with a note in Korean that said, "Only." Third shelf, the arnica. Not a question, an instruction offered like a fact. She stood in the kitchen with the note in her hand and thought about the man who had read her file like a document and reduced her history to leverage, and the man who knew which shelf had the arnica, and the uncomfortable truth that they were the same man, and she was going to have to figure out what to do with that. One night, she came to his office with a security update, and he was reading something at his desk and didn't look up immediately, and she stood in the room and said what she needed to say and turned to leave, and he said, in Korean, still looking at the document, "Don't go yet." She stopped, turned back. He set the document down and looked at her across the desk, and there was nothing strategic in the look, nothing calculated, nothing that was performing anything for any audience. It was just a person looking at another person and meaning what he'd said. She sat down. They talked for 2 hours, not about security, not about the operation, not about any of the machinery of the life they were both inside. He asked her about New Orleans, not the file version, not the record, and the foster homes and the things that had built her. The city itself, what it sounded like, what it smelled like. She told him about the heat and the music and the specific quality of light off the water in the early morning, the way the city could break your heart and hold you simultaneously, the way she had hated it and missed it every day since she left. He listened the way he did everything, completely without performance, with a quality of attention that made you feel like the only thing in the room that existed. She asked him about Soo Hyun. She had heard the name somewhere in the edges of conversations, always in a particular register, the register of something that had been put down and not picked back up. She asked directly the way she did everything. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told her. A younger brother. The apartment in Dobong-gu. The choices that had been made to keep Soo Hyun in school and out of the neighborhood's gravity, and the eventual price of those choices. Not death, but distance. A letter. 2 paragraphs. The particular brutality of a person you love deciding that loving you back is a risk they can no longer afford. He said it without inflection, without self-pity or performance, just the facts of it, stated in the voice of someone who had made peace with a wound by deciding the wound was simply part of the terrain. She looked at him across the desk and thought about the foster homes, about her foster sister, about the sealed record and what it had cost, and why she had never once regretted the cost. She thought about how you could spend your whole life protecting someone and still lose them to the thing you were protecting them from. She said, "The people who leave aren't always wrong." He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. "No," he said, "they're usually right." They sat in the silence of that for a while, Seoul outside doing what Seoul does, the two of them in a room that had suddenly become much smaller without either of them moving. She stood to leave eventually, got to the door. "Naomi!" She stopped. He had used her name, not Carter, not a designation, not the professional shorthand that everyone in this building used for everything. Her name, in his voice, with a weight to it that she felt in the back of her throat. She turned. He looked at her from across the room with the glass face not quite assembled, with something real and unguarded in the expression that she recognized because it was the same thing she had been carefully not looking at in herself for weeks. He didn't say anything else, and neither did she. And the silence between them held the thing that neither of them was going to say in this room on this night, and they both knew it, and they let it stay there between them, complicated, real, neither resolved nor abandoned. She left. She called Min Jae at midnight from the Hanam-dong apartment. Is it possible to fully understand someone and still know they're dangerous? Min Jae, warm and immediate and annoyingly accurate. Yes, it's called being in love with the wrong person. Naomi hung up, lay in the dark, gave herself exactly 4 minutes of complete honesty before she closed it back down and went to sleep. Now here is where everything arrives at once. Stay with me because every thread you've been holding is about to pull tight at the same moment. The meeting was with Chairman O, old guard, the kind of man whose courtesy was so practiced and so consistent that it had become a weapon. You could never quite find the edge of it, which meant you could never quite defend against it. He and Ji Hoon were negotiating a territory arrangement that had been delicate for months, the kind of meeting where the surface conversation and the real conversation were happening simultaneously in 2 different languages, and you had to be fluent in both. What Naomi didn't know when they walked into the private dining room on the 40th floor of a Gangnam skyscraper was what Sung Jin had spent the last 3 weeks building. He had fed Chairman O's people everything. Ji Hoon's schedule, security rotations, the layout, and one very specific, very deliberate piece of intelligence, Naomi's knee, which side, which angle, the exact vector of approach that would take her down. He had watched her train. He had watched you attack it. He knew the anatomy of her weakness better than she did. Sung Jin did not want Ji Hoon dead. He wanted Ji Hoon to watch the woman he had chosen over a decade of loyalty crumple in a room full of witnesses, and then he wanted to be the one standing there when Ji Hoon turned around looking for someone to trust. It was surgical. It was patient. It had been building since the night a New Orleans woman put him on a diner floor in Itaewon. Naomi walked into the room not knowing any of this, but she knew within 60 seconds of arrival that something was wrong. The two men flanking Chairman O were carrying at angles inconsistent with ceremonial security. She mapped the room quietly, exits, distances, sightlines, and repositioned herself without appearing to move with purpose. The dinner was served. The conversation was smooth and courteous and controlled. Ji Hoon spoke Korean loosely, not performing for the room, just present. She understood nearly all of it now. He still didn't know that. Across the table, Chairman O was impeccably gracious. He complimented the restaurant. He discussed the territory arrangement with the patience of a man who understood that patience was itself a form of pressure. He looked at Naomi once, not with hostility, with assessment, and then returned his attention to Ji Hoon with a small private smile that she filed immediately. And then the glance happened. Chairman O's two men, a flicker of eye contact so brief it barely existed. She was already moving before their hands reached for anything. The first man she handled the way you had built her to handle threats. Clean, controlled, no wasted movement. The second had been briefed. He came at her from the angle, the specific angle. He found the knee with the deliberate accuracy of someone following instructions, and the world tilted, and she went down. She had been dreading this moment since the day you first found that angle. The audience had been dreading it since the opening minutes of this story. She went down on one knee on the polished floor, soul glittering 40 floors below through all that glass, and for 1/2 second the room existed without sound. Then she got up. She got up, and she finished it, and she stood in the aftermath, with her knee screaming and her breathing working to recalibrate, and the room completely still around her. Ji Hoon had not moved from his chair. Glass face, absolute stillness, except his hand on the table had closed into a fist. Chairman O saw it. Naomi saw it. And Sung Jin, positioned near the door where he had placed himself to watch his plan succeed, saw it, and in that moment understood that he had miscalculated at the foundation. He had designed a plan to expose Ji Hoon's weakness. Instead, he had confirmed to an entire room that Ji Hoon had one and given it a name, and that name was standing up from the floor. The fist was the most dangerous thing that had happened all evening. The betrayal surfaced in the quiet that followed. Ji Hoon said Sung Jin's name once. Not loudly, not with anger, just the name in the tone of a man finalizing an account, and two men appeared at the door. Sung Jin stood, straightened his jacket, and he looked at Naomi, directly, for the first time without the contempt, with something far more complicated beneath it. The look of a man who wanted to be understood before he was gone. He didn't say anything. He left. Naomi watched him go. She thought about the man who had held this position before her, who had built everything he was inside his loyalty to Ji Hoon, who had been replaced without warning and responded by engineering her death through the most intimate knowledge he had of her body, her weakness, the specific degree of angle that would take her down. She thought about the care of it, the patience, the months. She didn't feel triumphant. She sat with the truth that the distance between what Sung Jin had done and what she herself was capable of was narrower than she wanted it to be. She had protected people she loved, using every piece of knowledge she had about the people threatening them. She had used weakness as a weapon. The difference between her and Sung Jin was the line she hadn't crossed yet. The word yet was the part she sat with. Chairman O straightened his tie. surveyed the room with the composure of a man who considered this a delay rather than a defeat. He looked at Ji Hoon, then at Naomi, then back at Ji Hoon with something almost like appreciation. "Interesting choice," he said, all the weight in the world in those 2 words. He stood, adjusted his cuffs. "I'll be in touch." He left. The door closed with a soft, expensive click. Ji Hoon said something in Korean under his breath. Not performing, just thinking. He said, "He won't let this sit." She heard it, said nothing, but she understood. The world beyond tonight was not resolved and was not going to become resolved. Chairman O was a chapter that had been interrupted mid-sentence, and he was the kind of man who found his place again. The room emptied until it was just them. Ji Hoon came to her, crouched down in front of her where she sat against the wall, leg extended, the brace fully visible for the first time, without her uniform concealing it. He looked at her knee with the focused, careful attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. And this, she was the thing that mattered. His hands were precise and deliberate and completely, utterly gentle. Neither of them spoke while he worked. Then she said, "You knew?" Not about the knee, about all of it. The file, the laundromat, the full assembled picture of her that had existed before she ever walked into his orbit. Yes, and you still think it was a fair offer? The city below them. Seoul at its most indifferent and most brilliant. The silence between his last word and his next one was the longest in the story. "No, I think it was the offer I was capable of making." She looked at him. He had said it without armour, without the glass face, without any of the machinery that kept him operational in the world he lived in. It had cost him something real, and she could see the cost of it. He reached into his coat, the knife, handle toward her. She took it, looked at it, set it on the floor between them, not returning it, not keeping it, setting it in the space between them, like a question that needed answering on her terms. "I don't need you to arm me. I need to know you understand what you're actually asking." He looked at the knife, then at her, and the glass face moved, not collapsed, not shattered, just opened, just enough, just one true unguarded moment. "I know exactly what I'm asking." She picked it up. He didn't move away. She didn't ask him to. They sat in the quiet of the 40th floor, with Seoul below them, and the weight of every conversation, and every corridor, and every late night, and every carefully not said thing sitting between them, like furniture they had both been moving around for months, and had finally, in this room, decided to stop pretending wasn't there. He said her name. Just her name. She looked at him. He looked back. And what passed between them in that look was not a beginning exactly. It was an acknowledgement, a mutual recognition of something that had been building since the diner, since the laundromat, since the Korean spoken under his breath, and the arnica on the 3rd shelf, and the 2 hours about New Orleans, and the silence that had held everything neither of them said. It was not simple. It was not safe. It was not the kind of thing that resolved into something clean. But it was real, and in the life Naomi Carter had lived, real was rarer and more valuable than safe had ever been. Across the city, Min Jae's phone lit up on her nightstand. 2 words from Naomi, "I'm okay." Min Jae read it, looked out her window at Seoul. Her boyfriend's arm found her waist in the dark. Warm, uncomplicated, present. She leaned into it. She typed back, "I know you are. That's not the same as being safe." She set the phone down and looked at the city and held in her chest the specific grief of loving someone who keeps choosing the hard thing. Not the grief of disapproval, but the grief of someone who understands exactly why the choice keeps getting made and loves the person anyway, and always will. Seoul, at 3 a.m. through 40, floors of glass. Naomi's reflection, sharp, still, the knife at her side, watching the city that had tried to swallow her and hadn't managed it. Behind her reflection, Kang Ji Hoon, watching her, not the city, watching her the way someone watches the only thing in the room that is real to them. Neither of them speaking. She had come from New Orleans with nothing and had been falling ever since and had landed here, in this room, in this life, beside this man who was dangerous and complicated and had never once lied to her about either of those things. She was still working out the price of all of it. Some nights she thought the price was too high. Most nights she didn't think about it at all. That was probably the answer. If this story found something in you, if Naomi found something in you, subscribe right now. Hit that bell so you're there when the next one drops. And before you leave, I want one word from you in the comments. One word for Naomi Carter from New Orleans. Just one. Drop it down there, and let's see what this story built in the people who stayed until the end. Because the people who stay until the end of a story like this one, they're always the most interesting ones in the room.